So control number one, multi-factor authentication. If you're not familiar with what multi-factor authentication is, or MFA for abbreviation, it's when you add another layer of authentication on top of your standard login, right? So everyone logs in with a username and password these days to applications. Multi-factor authentication says, all right, let's add another layer here so that we can really make sure this is the owner of the account using their username and password to log in. So maybe you get an SMS on your phone. Maybe there's an app that you're using that has a code on it, right?
Let's just state before we move on, though,
Yep.
SMS is not a good idea
No
for
good.
multi-factor authentication.
No good.
Multi-factor authentication means 2 or more. SMS is 1.2 at best.
Agreed.
It's not,
Still better than nothing, but
it's better
doesn't
than
count as
nothing,
one. Yeah,
But it's just better than one.
That's
and
right.
That's because of SIM swapping and all of these attacks that we see. So if you're implementing multi-factor authentication using SMS, look to enforcing it through an app, and then even better, use something like number matching that Microsoft have just enforced.
That's right. And that's what I wanted to talk about, because we have seen so many attacks, business email
many.
compromise,
Too
ransomware
many.
attacks that are a result of missing multi-factor authentication, right? But we've also seen, and there was a huge uptake at the beginning of this year, of business email compromise attacks that bypassed existing multi-factor authentication.
There was about 4 in one day. It
Yeah.
was the exact same attack vector.
Yeah, interestingly, it was only shortly after that Microsoft said, okay, something needs to happen here, and they introduced number matching.
Yeah.
So number matching.
But we can't just look at multi-factor authentication on email, right? It needs to be on
Yep.
all other externally facing systems. How often do we do a ransomware investigation where it's come through the VPN and the client has said, oh, we've got multi-factor authentication on your email, but not on the VPN. So it needs to be a risk assessment across the board. Find any of your externally facing authentication pages. Make sure multi-factor authentication is enabled. If you can't, go through some form of identity access management or cloud access security broker or something similar, right?
Absolutely.
Then also start to look at it. It's not just multi-factor authentication, which 100% is the first step, but then start to look at conditional access. So where are people coming in from? At what time of day are they coming in? Is this a normal user behavior? And then we had a question in the advisory team. How often should we be forcing multi-factor authentication on VPN? I want to get your opinion on this.
Yeah, well, a lot of the defaults for a lot of these appliances, and even Microsoft, can be quite large, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you're only required to enter MFA every 30 days, for example. And a lot of the time that's not good enough. We certainly saw times where MFA was bypassed, and then once it was validated in the bypass, the threat actor then had a valid MFA token for 30 days, right? They could do whatever they want after that point.
Absolutely.
So I definitely think it should be shorter than that, right? I mean, here at TL, we MFA almost every time.
We're pretty ruthless.
We're pretty ruthless, right? And it depends on conditions too, right? You should be asking for an MFA token if you're in a new location, new IP addresses, as often as possible, as far as I'm concerned.
And it's going to come down to the controls that you've got in place as well. So looking and saying, do we have some form of EDR? Do we have SIEM? Is everything monitored? What access are we giving to people? Is it going to allow lateral movement? Have we had an internal pen test? Each one of these different layers adds a different time requirement to say, okay, if we can say we've got EDR, SIEM, pen testing, red teaming, network segregation, you can put that time out further. But if you don't have any of those controls, then it's MFA as much as possible, because that is literally almost your only defense.
That's right. It's got to be laid defense in depth, right? You have to have all these layers so that if one fails, there's another one in place.
20 years we've been talking about defense in depth.
That's right.
And,
that's right. Oh, there's a new buzzword in town now, right?
Oh.
Resiliency.
Resiliency. I was
That's
going to
right,
say
yeah.
zero trust, but you went with resiliency.
There's a few buzzwords, isn't there? There's a couple. That always
Well,
float
zero
around.
trust makes up far too many of the buzzwords into one neat package that still means nothing. No one's really clearly defined it.
Indeed. So, that's multi-factor authentication.
That is MFA in a nutshell. Make sure it's everywhere.
Indeed.
Make sure your MFA is not just on email, but it's deployed everywhere.
And ideally, don't use SMS.
Don't use SMS. And look, I'll just touch on it briefly. There's a PowerShell script that you can use that will check all of your users in Microsoft 365, even other services, to tell you if multi-factor authentication is enforced.
Yep.
So it's a very
One-liner.
simple script. It's one line. If anyone who's watching this needs the script, reach out. We'll happily share the script. You should be checking your multi-factor authentication on a regular basis.
Absolutely.
So often we're seeing people saying, we've got MFA everywhere. And then we run the script and we find out maybe it's not true.
Yeah. When was the last time you checked?
Exactly. Trust but verify.